Thank you for such a warm introduction. I might tape it as well. Good afternoon. The Executive Director of UNFPA, Dr. Babatunde Osotimehin, was recently quoted as saying, "The health and rights of women and adolescents should not be treated as an afterthought in humanitarian response." This statement is of course true, but for me it says so much more than just that single statement. It says that right now, in many circumstances, we are failing to protect the fundamental human rights of women and girls. That crimes against women and girls are often silent and don't receive the focused and prioritization that they warrant. That women and girls of childbearing age between 15 and 49 made up 25% of more than the 100 million people in need of humanitarian aid in 2015. And it says, women and girls in need of aid because of conflict or disaster and without the protection of family and community are more vulnerable to sexual violence, sexually transmitted diseases, and unwanted pregnancies. We must recognise that for a woman who is about to give birth, or the adolescent girl who survived sexual violence, life-saving services are as vital as water, food, and shelter. And it says our current protection and responses strategies must include the needs of this target and vulnerable group. So I would sincerely like to thank the organisers, International Planned Parenthood Foundation, the Danish Family Planning Association, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights for organising this extremely important conference. This conference confirms that in the global community there is a promising and strengthened focus on this complex issue. War, instability, epidemics and disasters have left a long trail of chaos and destruction, resulting in the need for humanitarian aid being significantly outweighed by the growth in funding and services. We need to ensure that the humanitarian action includes recognition of the needs and vulnerabilities of this majority group, and that protection is always the core of humanitarian action. In many parts of the world, even under normal conditions, reproductive health issues are a leading cause of death and illness among women of childbearing age. The majority of these deaths and disabilities are preventable and unnecessary and result from the lack of access to services and information. We're talking about 800 women who die from complications during pregnancy or childbirth every single day. Of these 800 tragedies, 507 of them occur in emergency situations. Crises and humanitarian settings account for 60% of all preventable maternal deaths around the world. In fact, in 2014, the World Health Organization documented that the 10 countries with the highest maternal mortality ratios in the world are affected or emerging from war. The death of a mother very often means that newborn babies or small children are left behind and who, with their prime caregiver taken away, are more likely to die themselves. And the statistics tell the same story. Crises account for 53% of deaths of children under the age of 5 and 45% of neonatal deaths. Many complex circumstances and urgent needs arise when crises strike. Healthcare services, skilled birth attendants and emergency obstetric care often become unavailable. And women face other threats as well. The absence of health services and other factors increase the risk of contracting HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. And the breakdown of protection system often leads to the rise in gender-based violence, as we have already heard. This includes rape and sexual assault, human trafficking, domestic violence, and early enforced marriage. As a result of the prolonged Syrian crisis, the Danish Refugee Council have witnessed the depletion of refugees' resources, the level of poverty, and that debt is resulting in negative coping mechanisms. And one of these is the critical and dangerous trend is the resort to child labour. Not only are children working in dangerous and exploitative conditions, they are also much less likely to attend school. Another negative coping mechanism is early enforced marriage. DRC has witnessed that the difficult financial situation of Syrian families is encouraging early enforced marriage, as we know, as girls become the financial burden of their husbands upon marriage. And gender-based violence is also very prominent. Syrian refugee women are in critical situation, as many have lost their husbands and other family relatives in war, or the husband is still in Syria or elsewhere. And this leaves the women and female-headed refugee households fearing for their safety, more exposed to gender-based violence, and restricted in their movements, which again impacts their ability to access health facilities and employment opportunities. Wherever humanitarian disaster occurs, the burden of care women assume for children and others make it difficult for them to take proper care of themselves. Women may or often do neglect their own needs as they care for their families and neighbours. Over the last many years, as patron of UNFPA and the Danish Refugee Council, I've had the opportunity to visit a number of camps for refugees and internally displaced people. Different countries, different camps, and different reasons for their existence. From Dadaab in Kenya to Zatari in Jordan, to Zai Tama in Myanmar, to Takiti in Ethiopia. And these visits have left a strong impression on me. And while it's truly distressing to witness the often extremely difficult circumstances under which they live, they exist. At the same time, I cannot be anything but enormously impressed by the courage, skills, and ingenuity of the women and girls I have met. And I would like to name just two interventions that for these women and girls had a significant impact on their lives in these camps. In Zatari camp, I spoke with a number of heavily pregnant women. And they were already mothers and therefore knew the risks associated with childbirth. In Syria, they had given birth in hospitals with their own gynecologist and midwives. For them, the presence of UNFPA's reproductive health unit turned their fear and the potential risk associated with giving birth into thankfulness and hope. Today, UNFPA is delivering a larger share of its reproductive health services in crisis settings. In Takiti in Ethiopia, I witnessed the distribution of UNFPA's dignity kits. Now, these kits contain menstrual pads, soap, underwear, as well as other supplies required by circumstances or cultural contexts. The importance of these kits are not just for their own dignity, as they themselves describe them. They also provide relief. Relief that, for example, during their menstruation, they could continue to move about and provide water and food for their children. And here we must remember the cultural sensitivities and how they affect women. Experience shows that in crisis, women and girls are not only victims. They can also be leaders. They can also constitute an important resource to combat the challenges they face. Traditional gender roles often change during situation where it becomes necessary for women and girls to take on unconventional responsibilities and activities. And I've personally witnessed how women are capable of finding innovative ways to cope, how they assume a role to protect and support their families, and how they often continue to play pivotal roles in contributing to their local surroundings. We must continue and increase support of this valuable resource. So even though women and girls are extremely vulnerable, that we're all in agreement on, in humanitarian crisis, and they have particular protection needs, but they are also a resource to be utilised. Whether women live or die in a crisis often depends on whether they can access basic sexual and reproductive health services, which too often take a back seat to other urgent needs, like food and shelter. We need to build a better and more durable shelter. And this includes humanitarian responses that go far beyond the provision of food and shelter, as essential as those things are, and include reproductive health and family planning services and protection against gender-based violence. In 2016, the World Humanitarian Summit will convene, where stakeholders within humanitarian assistance will discuss how to improve the response to the needs of millions of people affected by conflict and disaster. This provides an opportunity to highlight sexual and reproductive health services as an important element of all humanitarian response. Women and girls' vulnerability to crisis is not a sign of weakness, but of inequality. Women and girls are powerful. If their needs are met and rights protected, they can become the catalyst of change. From the rubble of a crisis to the development, resilience, and stability of their families, communities, and nations. Women and girls, as an afterthought, won't do. Thank you.